thank you again for being here. If you like what we're doing, make a donation. We'd appreciate it. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Lauren. So, hello, everybody. Like Lauren said, my name is Alaina. Can everybody hear me? Am I projecting? Good. Okay. I know. So, like we said, I am a co-founder, co-host of podcast Your Brain on Science, where we talk all things psychedelic science, policy, and all things happening in that field. I'm also a PhD candidate at VCU, and I'm studying psilocybin for a myriad of things. My main focus is addiction and psilocybin, mainly opioid use disorder, so let's also introduce our other panelists. So Mario, do you want to introduce yourself first?
Sure. Hello everyone, I'm Mario de la Fuente. I come from Spain where I did my PhD in medicinal chemistry, and back in the day I was playing with the structure that is the foundation of psilocybin, tryptamine. Then I graduated to work with ayahuasca. We reported some neurogenic effects. After which I moved into the current research lab I'm involved in, studying the neuropharmacology of psychedelics as a whole. And that's, in a nutshell, what I do. I explore the really basic foundations of what these drugs can do in models that allow us to take out that subjective component that sometimes as humans bring into the picture.
Cool. And then Harrison?
So, hi everyone, my name is Harrison Elder. I'm also technically a PhD candidate. I'll be finishing my PhD up here in a week or so. But I'm a little bit more of a generalist than these two. I've spent some time in clinical research working with cannabinoids. I've worked with psychedelics in the laboratory, and then recently I've been focusing on things like the amphetamines and amphetamine opioid co-use that's unfortunately really escalating right now. But I've, like I said, I've spent time kind of being a bit of a scientific generalist, working between human models and animal models, and have spent a significant amount of time and published on psychedelic science relating to both psychedelic phenylethylamines like mescaline and things like the tryptamines, including psilocybin and DMT. So I'll just be kind of here giving them a little bit of scientific backup and adding my 2 cents as well.
Yeah.
So thanks for having me on.
I think you're the only person that's done clinical. You didn't clinical.
I did.
A little bit.
Ayahuasca.
Oh, with ayahuasca. Okay, so they're the clinical people. I'm not clinical, so we'll get a little bit of everything, which is nice. Okay. So I guess the first thing I'm just gonna ask like maybe 2 questions to them, and then we're just gonna open the floor up to like whoever has questions, because I feel like that's more informative anyways. So the first question I have for both of you and myself, I can answer too, is that I know, so the earlier panel was focused on like the state of entheogenic plants and fungi in like a broader sense. Can both of you just maybe briefly discuss like where you think the research is at in terms of psilocybin and maybe some other naturally occurring psychedelics like DMT or ayahuasca? Whoever wants to go first.
Sure. I mean, I can give my 2 cents on this first. I obviously, if you follow the issue at all, you might have seen a lot of work coming out of places like Johns Hopkins, some places like UCSF, and this UC San Diego is also kind of in on it. But most of the clinical work I'm sure you've seen has been coming out of Johns Hopkins, and this is kind of really in its infancy at the moment, but has really taken off over the last few years because. Interestingly, what they found is that these psychedelic experiences are very intense, and obviously they've used the, I don't know what the term is, but I don't know what the right term would be, but they've used kind of this orphan drug designation or this open door to go for people who are suffering from end-of-life anxiety with cancer patients, people who are really in kind of dire situations. Like I listened in on one of the last speakers talking about people who are in quote-unquote desperate situations going for these right-to-try laws. And so through that kind of window, they were able to open up this entire field of psychedelic research to the clinical sphere once again, take it out of animal models in the laboratory to actually giving it to people who are in dire need of psychological help. I don't know if you want to add anything on this in terms of the clinical angle, but bringing these medicines back into humans has been extremely controversial because, as I'm sure many of you know, these drugs are not just illegal in the sense of a Schedule 3 or Schedule 2, something like ketamine, but they are, in the same category as heroin when it comes to our drug laws in this country. So getting them into clinical trials was very, very difficult. So the progress that places like Johns Hopkins have made, bringing them to human trials, giving them to people, and actually cataloging their experiences and their benefit has been really kind of groundbreaking. This hasn't been done in 40 or 50 years. So a lot of the things that they're seeing there, I like to think of it as kind of coming at it from two angles. In the laboratory, we look at things from an animal model or a cell model angle, whereas people in the laboratory giving these to human beings and cataloging their experiences are coming at it from kind of the top down, and we're coming from the bottom up. And those two fields have yet to really meet. So
We're working on it.
if you read stuff online that tries to explain XYZ behavior because of XYZ receptor binding or this, that, or the other inside of a neuron, we're not really there yet. We haven't really met the two, bottom up and top down approaches yet. So I guess that's really what I would say.
Yeah, I think we're in the infatuation stage, the honeymoon, where the hopes are so built up. Society is responding to the news coming out from the scientific field, and I'm not an optimist by nature, so I can only imagine that a honeymoon lasts for as long as it lasts. So I think at some point we're gonna see a reaction, whether it comes from the science spotting something that we didn't know before, or some agents that start to pry upon things that make news once the psychedelics become old news, yet to be seen. But right now we're generating a whole breadth of data, solid data, that really justifies the stage that we're at and the kind of things that are moving forward. NIH is willing to put money into this. Even the DEA has been, kept on their shoes in some instances where they were trying to overstep their responsibilities. So I think we're in a pretty sweet moment. I can only hope that this will last and whatever comes out of it, yields good fruit for betterment of society.
Yeah. So I think I would add to that, and kind of building off of what both of you guys said. There's a lot of work that's being done, and I just like to recognize that we get all these news articles and all this hype around this miracle cure, psilocybin and LSD or what have you, and MDMA even. And I think it's just important to highlight that all of the research is still very new with the modern technology that we have and the modern ethics that we have versus what it was in the 1950s. So I think just keeping that in mind and questioning what you're reading is really important, because that's what we do as scientists, right? We kind of question everything. We don't just take face value as the title of a paper that comes out. So I think that's super, super important, and asking better questions or more questions kind of helps what Harrison was talking about in that meeting in the middle of because it's a matter of the people doing the research, but it's also a matter of the people in the public who can help inform what they want as treatment, who are actually going through these mental health issues, and just can help inform the research that's going on. So I think it's super important.
Yeah, I mean, to piggyback off that, and something that I've kind of heard talked about a lot today, we're all kind of the face of this resurgence, right? Everyone in the public and in the scientific sphere is a part of this resurgence in scientific research and general interest. And so the way that we represent ourselves and the way that we kind of promote this movement is definitely a big part of how legitimate it becomes and how much research gets done. So I think that's just something that I would definitely add to that. Saying that we get funding, we get interest, we get to go to conferences and present our research when people are legitimately interested in these things, and less so when the claims are maybe a little outlandish or people aren't doing their homework. So
yeah,
it's great that we have so many people who are willing to promote this, and it's awesome that we have all these people here that are face of this movement and moving it forward. Interest in psychedelics as medicines and in general as decriminalizing nature. But just kind of keep that in mind. You're the evangelicals of the entire movement. So what you say does have weight, and what you do has weight.
Yeah, definitely. So I guess one of the major questions that I always get in like when I'm just talking to people about what I do is if I think that the like subjective hallucinations or the mysticalness of the psychedelics are like a part of what would be essentially therapeutic. So I was just curious to know your guys' thoughts on that. Personally, I'm in the middle. I think that for some people, they may benefit from a full-blown, spiritual experience from things like psilocybin, mescaline, or DMT, what have you. But I think also, obviously, as being a basic pharmacologist and like brain researcher, that there is an aspect in the brain that kind of helps that move along, I guess, in a way to say. So just curious what your guys' thoughts. Are you one way or the other? Are you like kind of in the middle?
Yeah, I'll take it.
What's the evidence?
I think I share your position, Alaina, in that grayness of like just lying in the middle, and it's not just about not being non-committal. I'm quite an opinionated guy myself, but I do think that transformative experience can mean a lot to certain people, and I think we're gonna get to see a path where we can spot the kind of populations that respond more positively to that transformative experience. That probably comes attached with a certain personality pattern. Not everyone is spiritual, and a lot of people don't need any spirituality in their lives, and they're absolutely fine not having that. For other people, that means a lot. So I think in that regard, building those narratives means a lot to some people, maybe not so much to others. At the same time, I work actively in drug development and discovery. So I think the other thing that psychedelics bring us is this new playground we haven't really explored all the way yet. And this is not to try to come up with, to outdo psilocybin or I do DMT or LSD. We can use those scaffolds as inspiration to go to land elsewhere. And just to give an example of what I'm saying, there's this company, it's called Bright Minds Bio. They took the scaffold of psilocybin and they came up with an anti-epileptic drug for kids that experience Dravet syndrome. So this is to say that I don't think the benefit is only on the subjective effects. There's a lot more things that we can harvest out of these molecules that right now we're allowed to play with.
Yeah, and I think that's the cool part of drug development as well, is that, there are certain populations of people that should not have this full-blown hallucination, psychedelic experience, and like people who have like psychosis or like schizophrenia, like disorders. So I think by playing with those molecules and maybe developing medications that could still be helpful for some people without having to go through this full-blown experience also does have a little bit of value.
I mean, so I stepping out of my box maybe a little bit as a scientist. I think part of there's been a really big push in the drug development and pharmaceutical spheres to take these psychedelic molecules and tweak them, change them, otherwise make them proprietary and useful for Western modern medicine, right? And that's kind of where the argument has started to come up around, are the hallucinations necessary, right? These drug companies are interested, and medicine in general is interested in whether or not we can retain the benefits of a psychedelic experience on things like depression, addiction, anxiety, etc., without having to make you completely incapacitated and hallucinating and go through the whole experience that is, quote unquote, I mean, in medical terms, somewhat dangerous to put you in that vulnerable state. And so they're really interested in, can we harvest these benefits without making you go through the hallucination process, right? I personally think that really strips down and kind of changes the entire benefit structure of a psychedelic. I mean, the whole point is that it doesn't fit into the way that we've been looking at medicines for these drugs, or for these conditions, excuse me. If you try to take a psychedelic molecule and take this, hallucinations and spiritual nature out of it and try to sell it back to somebody as a once daily medication, you've essentially ruined the entire nature of what that was giving someone, right? And so that's why I mostly fall on the side of you can't take away the subjective hallucinogenic properties of the drug and still retain the benefits, but that's me stepping definitely much outside of my scientific expertise and giving my own personal beliefs on the subject.
Well, so that leads me, so this is the last question I'll ask, and then I'll open it up to everybody else. So that kind of brought me to say, like, do you think that something like psilocybin fits into this medicalized model as or do you think that it needs to be something different, like a decrim, like they talked about a little bit before us, or like other routes? Like, is there like a middle thing that like we can do? Does it just need to be completely legalized? Like, do you guys have any thoughts on that? I truly don't know what the right answer is, so I'm just picking brains at this point.
I think it kind of goes back to what I tried to say opening up with, we're all the face of the movement. You all know people who have probably used these substances to great benefit, and maybe some people who have used them to not so great a benefit, potentially getting themselves into dangerous or difficult situations. So I think that it kind of falls somewhere in between. I don't think that access to something like this should be limited on any basis. I mean, they're talking about decriminalized nature. It's a part of nature. It's our kind of our right to try something like that on our own. But in the same breath, I would also say that in the current environment in America, people will want to capitalize on that and push it to people, and it will become maybe a little bit perverted from what you're thinking it might be, if access was just generally totally open to people. So I think there's obviously a place for the medical benefit, but also a place for us to not get in trouble for having them. I guess that would be my take.
Yeah, I think, I come from the scientific side. I do believe that medicalization is not only something to contemplate, but something necessary. I think it's the one way we have to put some safeguards that really can protect people from harm. And on that front, I don't attribute any particularly special value to things coming from nature, from a synthetic lab. I absolutely don't. I see pharmacology as purely materialistic and biological, although they can trigger the most amazing experience known to the human mind. But at the same time, if I think about the larger population, I do think we need to have some safeguards in place, and either the community is able to afford those to themselves, or we need to abide by the regulatory agencies. And I feel strongly about this, especially today. A couple of days back, I picked up a fight. There's this so-called Church of psilocybin. These guys that try to push for this sacrament, as they call it, where they were feeding 5-methoxy-DMT to psilocybin mushrooms. Doesn't sound too bad. What they were claiming, and what's going on there, is that the mushroom was transforming the 5-methoxy-DMT into something else that they call psilomethoxin. Well, psilomethoxin, if that molecule turns out to be true and be there, is a neurotoxin. And we know that from animal work that goes all the way back to the 60s. So, the path to hell is paved with good intentions. I do think we need to the safeguards in place to kind of curb all these things that sound like fantastic ideas and are well intentioned, but at the end of the day can harm people.
I think that's a really good point to make, because there are a lot of people who will take advantage of other people, right? That's just like kind of being human, and some people suck, to put it blatantly. So I think that that's kind of where the medical model comes in, is it can put things in place that can protect people from people who aren't certified in giving therapy, right? That are giving people drugs and just letting them, giving people psilocybin or whatever, and just kind of letting them ride out the trip that could be potentially opening wounds of trauma that person that's guiding them is not well equipped to deal with. I think that's a really big thing that can kind of be helped a little bit by accreditation of psychedelic assisted therapy and what have you. So I think that's a really good point to make about kind of a pro for medicalization. And then you made a good point about the con for medicalization, is it too many laws, too many safeguards for something that's,
I think it's just trying to fit psychedelic therapy or psychedelic.
Fit something spiritual and transcendent into this westernization.
Into our current model of
without fixing every other thing.
Yeah. I mean, I think that just to piggyback off of what you guys were saying, you hear a lot probably that these natural something like DMT or psilocybin is one of the safest drugs that you could consume. And I think when people talk about that, they talk specifically about it's something like it's LD50, or the fact that you probably will never.
What's an LD50?
A lethal dose, right? What the typical lethal dose of the drug might be, right? And I see this a lot in lay articles that I read, or when I talk to people who are arguing for greater access to something like psilocybin. People talk a lot about how safe it is, or I heard this a lot in the beginning of the cannabis movement, with how safe of a drug it is, right? How much you could consume without hurting yourself. in comparison to something like an opioid. And while that's technically true of the toxicity of like the actual physical harm that you could cause to yourself by consuming some of these psychedelic drugs is quite low. It's very difficult to hurt yourself physically with these drugs. That doesn't mean that doesn't mean that they're harmless, right? It doesn't mean that you can't get yourself into some serious trouble eating too many mushrooms or having too much psychedelics on board. And so I think that keeping that in mind when we're talking about the dangers involved is important. And I feel like I'm being a bit of a downer on this, but I think I think it's important to know the difference between what is physically dangerous and what is actually in reality could be dangerous for a person. But I've now gotten us off topic, so sorry about that.
Any other comments before I open to questions?
Yeah, I think there's a thirst for these experiences that I don't think it worries me, but I could see how some people can prey upon that, right? I saw the other day a post on LinkedIn. This guy, I heard about this psychedelic fish, and people were just like tagging along. I will try it anytime. Where do they sell it? It's actually something that I looked into, and it looks like something you really don't want to be under. Just because it creates an altered state of consciousness doesn't mean it's something that you should be craving. And this is some kind of ciguatera, something it's provoked by the algae that the fish feeds upon. And yeah, you certainly would get in a dreamy like state. We don't know the exact nuances of it, but you don't want that. So this thirst for these experiences that people tend to show worries me when it comes to people that might actually have bad intentions. I do think there might be room for a recreational or self spiritual routes towards using psychedelics outside of a medicalized routes, but I think we need to be very aware of the dangers that integrating this in a capitalistic society for profit could entitle.
Like having some harm reduction available.
Like harm reduction policies that are actually enforced and watched by everyone involved in it.
Yeah. Well,
Switch gears a little bit and talk about the actual benefits here.
well, I was gonna say we could do that, or we could, if you guys have questions for us. I don't know how much time we specifically have, so I figured like we're here to be a resource for the public. So like if anyone has any questions, we will answer them.
I'll start off. Thank you guys for doing this, by the way. I want to, make a quick comparison to kind of the cannabis side of things, where we recently found out there's a lot of different cannabinoids out there. There's a whole spectrum. They impact us differently. Everyone knows Delta-9 and THC. Is there a similar type of nuance, I guess, to the psilocybin side, or really to the kind of psychoactive aspects of a spectrum of different molecules that might act similarly, that might not necessarily just be psilocybin or DMT, etc.? Or if it augments kind of the psychoactive effect that you feel?
I think it's on a case-to-case basis. For instance, in ayahuasca, you have your source of DMT, psychotropionitis, and then you have your source of MAOA inhibitors that render the DMT active. And on that second side, you have a wide array of molecules, alkaloids, as we call it, that contribute to it. Obviously, those can have their own nuances as to what the ultimate experience is like. There's a lot of talk about that around psilocybin, the whole entourage effects. I think there's the key distinction here, and I'm taking it all back to the chemistry. Sounds kind of derogatory, but cannabinoids are a lump sum of fat versus the alkaloids in psilocybin, which are like prime amino, phenyl, or tryptophan compounds. Why am I saying this? The chemical structure determines what the path is going to be, and I have a hard time thinking that the contents on the psilocybin mushrooms that are not psilocybin or psilocin can really make it to the brain and contribute to the whole experience. It's more of a hypothesis. I don't think it's formally tested, but if I had to take a guess, I think the entourage effects is a lot more, plays a lot more of a role in the cannabinoid side than it does, for instance, in the case of mushrooms.
So actually, I heard a little bit of a talk, the last talk that was in here, talking about the difference between peyote and San Pedro. I actually think that this question applies a lot more to the differences between those different cactuses than potentially psilocybin mushrooms. There's a lot fewer structures and different chemicals that are in psilocybin mushrooms that, in my opinion, as Mario just said, really can contribute to that psychedelic state that you get. Whereas with the different cacti, there are a plethora of different phenethylamine type compounds that are quite similar and do have activity that can either make it, I don't know if I would say more spiritual or not, but more unpleasant or not. So peyote is well known because it is a very pure and high potency source of mescaline. Whereas these other cacti that are not illegal, San Pedro, Peruvian torch, things like that, they have their own complement of these very similar molecules that can make them more prone to causing nausea, more prone to being jittery, because they have these other higher contents of tyramine and other similar phenethylamine type compounds. So I think it comes a little bit more into play there. But if you're asking about just the natural sources of these compounds, then that's what I would say. If you're asking about similar compounds that have been tweaked to cause similar but slightly different effects, I'd say go look up research chemicals and designer drugs, because that's really where that field has gone in a whole other direction, tweaking those molecules.
Cool. Any other questions?
I want to add something to that. As Harrison was saying, I think it's very interesting, and it also comes from recent events. Psychedelics are so humbling in so many ways, and one of the humbling experiences that come after is how much they can mislead you into believing into what's going on. So there's a study that in which people were given LSD or psilocybin. They couldn't tell. They were asked, do you think you got the LSD or you got the psilocybin? They couldn't tell one from the other unless they knew what they were given. And the whole psilocybin that I was talking about earlier, these people received something that they were told is completely different from mushrooms. And they had an experience that was completely different from mushrooms. At the end of the day, it was mushrooms. So this also speaks to sometimes when people try to come up with, oh, you know, this variety of cubensis is better than this one in terms of the entourage effect, not amount of psilocybin. A lot of it might be just our will to believe that there's a difference there, rather than something that we can pull down to the pharmacology side.
Yeah, I think that's good. Anybody?
Got a question. Maybe it was commented on before I walked in, but I'm curious, do you see any differences between a macro versus a micro dose? Is there a benefit to taking small amounts regularly versus taking a large amount for, one time every few months?
So I'll go first on this one. So I would say that based on current studies, like scientific evidence, a lot of the studies going on with psilocybin or more with psilocybin than LSD, I would say, but a lot of them are focusing on moderate doses, like a normal dose, as you would say, maybe a little bit less than like a full-on recreational dose, but not a microdose.
Familiar at all.
Right.
I don't know.
But so most of them are focusing on like something that would be considered moderate,
Okay.
and those studies are the ones that we see out of like Johns Hopkins, who are giving psilocybin once or twice in combination with a psychedelic therapy to do smoking cessation, alcohol studies, the end-of-life studies. So those are a larger dose or moderate dose 1 or 2 times, and it's producing significant effects in several studies, studies that have also been replicated with depression and treatment-resistant depression at Johns Hopkins and also in Imperial College London and at UC San Diego, I believe. So those are all with the evidence that is currently available with psilocybin at least is speaking more towards a larger or moderate dose once or twice, producing sustained 6 months effects.
Do you think that's applicable from a pharmacological standpoint?
Yeah, I would say that makes sense. Because the whole idea, like the hypothesis behind this, right, is that you're giving this dose, it's producing this experience, and maybe some pharmacological effects in the brain through neurons and receptors that are causing this increase in like plasticity within your brain, new connections that you wouldn't normally have, and that's what's producing these potential, well, a combination of both or one or the other. That's what we're currently researching, right? Is producing this therapeutic effect. So I would say based on like what we've seen in lab models and then what we're seeing also in people is pretty like cohesive. In terms of microdosing, a lot of the literature and the evidence with microdosing right now, either their doses aren't actually microdoses and they're still psychologically active, so you're not really, you know, like you're just high, you know, right? So, which, whatever, that's fine, but that's not really getting at like the microdose, non-active kind of question. Or a lot of the studies are currently in people who already regularly microdose. So like I literally saw a title of a paper that said like microdosing shown to increase productivity and creativity in microdosers. So it's like, well, yeah, that would make sense, right? So I would say for both sides of it, I think more research is obviously needed. But I think right now the evidence is showing that this moderate kind of once or twice dosing and these long-term effects is more consistent than the literature with the microdosing. So it's my trying to keep it short.
Yeah,
You guys
makes
have any
sense.
comments?
I mean, so I would say a lot of the work that I did when I was back doing clinical research was on the placebo response, actually, in people who were being treated for chronic pain. Okay, so we did a lot of work with placebo response in clinical trials, and one of the major things that I gleaned from my time there was that the more active the placebo, right, the more that you can feel the placebo working inside you, the more that you're prone to saying that it's an active drug that's working for you, right? And so the way that I've started to see, at least in the research, what I've seen is that these papers that come out on microdosing, at least the well-controlled ones, either find no benefit or a small benefit in terms of people's present mood and how much they say it's helping them, right? Not on any objective measures where they're doing some sort of task or objectively their performance is being measured. Those typically aren't changed by microdosing. But the subjective measures that they ask people about, how's your mood, how productive do you feel, things like that, are altered because people feel slightly different when they microdose, right? And so I think that from a cynical point of view, you could say it's not helping at all. If you want to be an optimistic point of view, you could say it's people harnessing the placebo response. There's nothing wrong with the placebo effect. Honestly, it's an amazing thing that the human body can do is reduce your pain, make you happier with a total hooey treatment. But if
To
you
believe you're doing something right.
Yeah.
Right, exactly. But if you can find a way to harness that placebo effect to your benefit, more power to you, I guess would be my response. But I think a lot of these studies, at least that I've seen come out about microdosing, have been on the side of objective benefits, few, subjective benefits, potentially some.
Yeah, I second that, right? If you go to the scientific literature, the chance you have to get finicky and go for the double blind or as close as double blind as you can get, it's also the placebo effect. But just because the literature is saying that doesn't mean you cannot exploit something that feels good to you. If I were to get creative as to other paths that microdosing or mini dosing can take, we published a paper on ayahuasca enhancing divergent thinking as opposed to convergent thinking. And I could see how, from the pharmacological perspective, you stimulate the receptor, you introduce some noise into your brain functioning that is going to enable that divergent thinking. And I think that could be something that could use to your advantage if you're in like a creative capacity or in a situation where you need that. Would I recommend that to a emergency room nurse? No. Firefighter? No. But if you, a graphic designer and you want to introduce that kind of noise in the system that might help, think outside of the box, by all means. So long you know what you're doing and what you got in your hands.
For better or worse, I tend to hear the word capitalism whenever I hear the word medicalization. There are various reasons for that. But I'm wondering, from your perspective, you're situated in this field, where where are you seeing the funding going, and where do you see it coming from? Is it still very much restricted to pharmacology or the pharmaceutical industry, or are there outside capital interests investing in research?
So I'll just say first off, the U.S. government itself provides very little funding for psychedelic research. There's like maybe 4 or 5 labs, including like the one that I'm in, that actually have money from the like National Institutes of Health to do psychedelic research. So a lot of the funding is coming from outside sources. Do you want to talk?
Yeah, I've worked with a fair share of venture capital funds that jumped into this space. A lot of them are just like trying to go for the next big thing after the cannabinoid bubble. They already made their money in the cannabinoid space, and they were going for the next big thing. So yeah, I think in terms of if we were to put it in scale, definitely there's a lot more private money than there is public money into this. But at the end of the day, they're all gonna have to face the same kind of challenges, right? They're gonna have to get before the FDA. They're gonna have to demonstrate this is a placebo effect, or it's not. If it's a placebo effect, sorry, but they probably won't get through. And at the same time, throw in all the safeguards that I was talking about to make sure that what they get out there is decent.
I would just, yeah, these two are the ones that honestly have worked more with the funding issue for psychedelics specifically. I've gotten to do my psychedelic work on the side without groveling for funding for it specifically, but at least from what I've seen, a lot of the funding that's coming into the psychedelic space now, at least the funding that's pushing forward non-hallucinogenic analogs and things of that nature tends to be from private firms or institutional money from, massive universities have their own research funds that they can put into this kind of stuff. So it's not so much from the NIH or NIDA unless you can convince them to give you money, like Alaina has recently actually. She should get a little shout out for that because she's convinced the federal government to give her some funds to do psilocybin research, but that's rare. It's tough to do.
And I think it's also very much where you're headed. For instance, if you're trying to cure depression, private money is gonna come your way in like droves. If you're going for a rare disease, orphan disease, then you're probably gonna have to rely on the federal agencies that are willing to put money into help you for conditions that are not that profitable. But yeah, there are avenues for that too.
We had a question over here.
Yeah, as a clinician, I'm not hearing much about the clinical trials like Hopkins and places like that. Psilocybin is a catalyst, but there's also the whole container process of treatment, which is preparation, monitoring, integration being a huge piece. That's been its downsides. Trials of integration have gone on. So it's not just the psilocybin, it's the whole treatment that you have to get results.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Did you have anything else before I start talking?
No.
Okay, yeah. I just wanted to echo for if you guys didn't hear what he said, is that when we talk about these clinical trials, it's not only just the drug, right? It's usually in combination with a therapy, and it's also has a whole protocol and a whole process behind it where you have meetings with your therapists or the doctors that are going to be in the room. You have this preparation, this discussion with them about what you're going into, the possibilities of the outcomes, and sometimes at Hopkins, a recent paper was published with their smoking cessation study that they have a treatment manual that goes through these kind of different like levels of prompts of like things to consider while you're in this state to help with quitting smoking. And so that's a whole thing that goes into it. And then you have visits with this therapist multiple times, and then you have follow-up or integration, which unfortunately, like you mentioned, usually only is about maybe 1 to 3 follow-ups right after the trials, and then may, depending on the trial, continue on at a 3-month, a 6-month, or a year follow-up. So I think it is important to know that one of the bigger critiques, I guess, of the clinical research is that there's a lack of integration, because this integration of this experience, right, you might feel great right after you take psilocybin, like for a few days or up to a week or even up to a month, but you might, have it might not be linear, like it might not be an exponential increase in your mood. So you might, feel really good for a week and then be like, oh, well, I feel, like I'm questioning things from my experience or what have you. And sometimes there's not that support in place. So I think that's a place that the field could really go into investigating more, is like different aspects of the integration. Or do you have any?
That's also been an issue with their drug approval process, actually. So one of the few panels that scientific panels I've sat through at conferences, one of the first ones that was really salient to me was a panel that they had a bunch of FDA scientists on, talking about what they're gonna need to see to approve these drugs, right? And one of their big sticking points was, okay, well, there's huge changes in these trials, but you've given people super nice, niche, tailored therapy for 6 months. How do we, where are the controls in place? How do we know that these people didn't just get super nice, niche, tailored therapy and they feel better, which is what therapy often does for people. And it was
Sometimes.
sometimes, right? And so it was a really interesting debate for me to listen to. And I guess what ended up shaking out of that whole debate with these FDA scientists was that the drug itself, they needed to show that it was acting as a true catalyst and that these people weren't finally getting the attention from mental health professionals that they desperately needed for a long time, and that was really the big change that was happening. And so, believe me, I'm sitting here, so I believe that there's that the catalyst is truly a big part of it. But it also kind of brings me all the way back to what we were talking about originally with, is it the hallucination? Is it that subjective experience that is helping people, or is it something innate to the drug? Personally, what I would say is that if you're getting, effects 6-12 months out from this drug and therapy, that it's acting as a catalyst for you to maybe absorb the therapy a little bit better, or
Making a behavioral change.
make a behavioral change that's not so much pharmacologically driven for that full 12 months, but it might have been initially, right? But that debate is really going on, whether, how much of a role that therapy plays, and as far as I've heard and as I've read, the therapy is still very much a big part of psychedelic treatment at the moment, right? At least at Johns Hopkins. The whole package, right? Which makes it difficult to access for people who need it. It's expensive, it's time consuming, and I think that was something that Mario mentioned earlier, that the treatment access for people. It's not easy.
Part is stepping into that with their program, trying to make it available.
Right.
Really recently.
Yeah.
On the attention side of things, yeah, I mean, psychology is psilocybin, right? Like, psilocybin is taking the spotlight, but at the end of the day, at least the most advanced paradigms is psychedelic assisted therapy.
Right.
So the psychedelic piece is assisting the therapy, which we know works for better, sometimes better, sometimes worse. And like Harrison was saying, the FDA doesn't care much about feelings. It's gonna be, if you're making the case that it's psilocybin plus therapy, then you have a 2x2 matrix where you need to tell me that psilocybin alone and therapy alone is better than either of them separate and work better together, which obviously increases the number of experiments that you need to run and the expenses and so on and so forth. So yeah, therapy is definitely a piece that you need to consider.
And why would a drug company be interested in something that has 2 doses?
Right, exactly. Well, that's the other issue, right? So
It's so profitable that they can fit in a model where it's profitable. Yeah, they can
they'll
fit
figure
it.
it out.
They're working on it.
Yeah.
They'll make it work.
Yeah, right. That's funny. And so if anyone's interested in that topic more, check out the podcast. I'm doing a shameless plug. We have a couple episodes with Johns Hopkins researchers who are doing that. Johns Hopkins. I always say it wrong. But so we have an episode actually on psychotherapy and that aspect of the therapy and the psilocybin as a whole, with Natalie Gukasian, Dr. Natalie Gukasian. So check that out if you're interested in kind of learning more about that. Do we have any other questions?
Sort of something that I've been through already. It's not necessarily a question, but as far as from what I've tried and with the strand of I don't know if you heard of Enigma. To me, that one put it another higher, it's another level with that one. But you can say if you took a gram or so of that, to me it was more like taking maybe an eighth or something like that, on that particular case. But with like microdosing, I myself put my own self through a 6-month therapy on that. My own personal, none, no doctors, anything of that sort. I would say like a 0.5 is where I stay at as far as not tripping or anything. And it brings me in a more of an uplifting mood. I don't know how, say about the placebo effect, things of that nature, but I've just done it in my own environment. And to me, I feel like it's helped me. Even now, that's where I'm at. But still, I think that's, on a 3 times a week type thing, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. And to me, I feel like it's been doing good for me. I'm also a Navy vet as well. I've been in the military for 4 years. I was on a crazy ship, the Enterprise, which was like it's in the bottom of the totem pole. So for me to come out of that and still be able to keep a smile on my face from the things I've seen and had to do there, I think it's healthy. That's all I can really say. I think it's worked for me. I don't know about everyone else. I done got into gardening and all kind of things, which to me is kind of weird, but hey, I like it a lot.
Yeah, I think that when it comes to people's stories and their experiences, I think that no one can discount your experience, right? That's your individual experience.
Right.
And I think we're kind of just bringing that scientific evidence part, but I'm not gonna sit here and be no, that's not true, that didn't work for you, because science says it didn't. But I think the issue with a lot of people in this space is that they'll go and say well, this microdosing regimen or this whatever regimen it is works for me, so I'm going to teach you how to do it and make money off of you, even though it might not work for you, or you might have issues with other cardiac conditions, things that general people don't think about. And so I think that's kind of where the issue is with being it's like he mentioned, it's what you contribute to the people in the movement and the education, and it's all about harm reduction too. And I think psychedelics are so individual. We need, and I think it's no matter if they work or don't work in science or whatever might have you, whatever happens. I think that the real thing that psychedelic medicine is pointing to is individualized medicine. We need individualized mental health treatments for people because everyone is not the same. And so I think that is kind of what kind of speaks to that in this whole hype bubble economy.
Yeah, I think I should clarify as well, saying that something that has a placebo effect or is acting through a placebo effect doesn't mean it has no effects at all.
Right.
That's not, just to clarify, that's not what a placebo really is. And you can have an active comparator in a trial, something that is actively working, but maybe not the way that you're trying to test. I guess my point being, a placebo doesn't mean it's not doing anything. Right? It just means that it might not be making objective changes in the way that you might think. But if you can harness that subjective state, in a good way, rather than taking a pill every day, and thinking that that's helping. I think a lot of the reason that it works for people like yourself, honestly, is that just the intentional act of doing that 3 times a week is putting yourself into a headspace where you're I want to work on my life and how I'm, viewing my life and the things that I'm doing. It's an intentional, repeated act that might make you feel a little different, and that kind of catalyzes your change. Whether or not that's working through new neuron growth in your brain or not, it's making change for you because you're intentionally doing that. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, coping mechanism, true effect, placebo effect, or placebos, because there are different kinds. At the end of the day, it's a risk-benefit, right? Equation. And if you're not doing yourself any harm and you think you benefit from it, who cares about what the latest paper said on microdosing and placebo, right? That's something that can also apply to the big dose or moderate dose, right? We could argue but all those insights you got are false. There wasn't no you merging with the earth. We know for a fact you didn't merge with anything. And yet, if you benefit from it in a way that helps you go about your day, who cares if it was a false narrative or true?
Well, yeah, that's the other thing about use of psilocybin or other plant medicine is that these have been being used forever, right? We're not the medical model and the the therapy model, we're not the first people to figure this out. It's been figured out. So if it's been working for however many years, right? Like, I'm not gonna go, call up some indigenous tribes and be like, you're a liar. Like, no way. So I think it's just important to recognize that, like, the way that we are studying things isn't the only way that things have to go. And that's like another issue with these clinical trials and what have you, is that, and just the fitting of this experience and these compounds into this model that we have right now. Like, this double-blind controlled trial might not be good to test psychedelics and like that, but that's the standard, so that's what we're working with right now. So I think it's just, that's why it's important to have like these types of conversations with general public, not just amongst ourselves, because it brings new perspective and new conversations.
I'm curious what your perspective is on the scheduling. And I'm sorry, I ended the interview with Decrim with the same question. How do you feel about the way psilocybin has been scheduled? It's Schedule 1 right now, which means it has no medicinal benefits. Cannabis is still at that state. And I mean, nationwide, we're moving forward to accepting that cannabis has some benefits to offer. And the research that you guys are doing collectively is saying that psilocybin has some things to offer as well. Maybe it shouldn't be Schedule 1. Where do you think it should be? And how do you think we should get there?
I think it's gonna come down from Schedule 1 really soon. It's a very good question, because obviously from the things that I've seen and the safeguards that I think needs to be in place, I wouldn't see it as something that you can sell as coffee. But at the same time, you have melatonin, which is a decent drug, sold as a nutrition supplement.
It should have safeguards as well.
Right. So it's a little bit of a heterogeneous picture. At the same time, I think the DEA could be doing a much better job at really working into renewing their schemes under which they work to really make sure that there are enough safeguards that you're not going to ruin your life over something that doesn't really pose a hazard to the public health or to yourself, but at the same time, prevents abuse in the form of taking advantage of people that might be interested. And I don't know what the scheme is. I leave that up to a policy maker, but there's definitely a lot of room for change for the good. Yeah.
Sure.
I'll just throw my 2 cents in. It's insane that a lot of drugs are in Schedule 1, to be totally honest.
I agree.
The reason that I'm sitting here personally, and a lot of the work that I've done outside of the laboratory has been due to the fact that a lot of these drugs have been unfairly shoved into Schedule 1 before we had a chance to show that it would benefit.
Yeah.
So they'll come down. I've talked to some people about MDMA rescheduling and things like that, and I think they're shooting for Schedule 3.
It's gonna be bifurcated.
Okay, but there
I've heard Schedule 3.
There are current efforts underway to reschedule these. Where they're going to fall, I can't tell you. Because psilocybin and psychedelics in general don't act through dopaminergic addiction pathways, I think that there's a much greater chance that they get dropped lower than Schedule 2. I wouldn't get my hopes up that they go any lower than Schedule 2 for the moment.
Wouldn't expect that, but I'm curious to tie back to some of the previous conversation. Do you think that would be an isolate compound, or do you think it would just be a whole extract from
They're gonna.
They get sneaky with those things.
Yeah, if they reschedule them, it's gonna be like they did with Marinol, in my opinion.
Okay.
So I don't know if you know about
Sure,
Marinol.
I do.
THC.
Yeah.
Pharmaceutical THC is Schedule 3. I don't know if any of y'all know that,
Yeah.
but it's already Schedule 3, whereas cannabis and THC from cannabis plants is Schedule 1 federally, which is just like a crazy eyes looking in 2 directions type deal that I have no idea how they hold those two things in
policy
their
is not the
minds.
researcher's business, right?
But it's like
It
a
is.
specific pharmaceutical preparation versus the
I'm gonna
plant
talk
that
about
anyone can access. I doubt they're going to remove psilocybin mushrooms, psilocybin-containing mushrooms from Schedule 1, even if they do drop psilocybin down. If that
Okay.
makes sense. They're really sneaky
That
about
does.
that stuff, and the DEA has to justify its own existence. We have a specific compound that we work with called DOI that's a very widespread psychedelic drug. No one uses it because it's not very pleasant to trip on, but
How long is it like been
Yeah, it's like a 24-hour trip.
Yeah, it's like a 30-hour trip.
Count me out.
But they recently tried to put that into Schedule 1, even though we've used it for decades on an
Just
unscheduled
research.
basis, and we had to fight them on that just recently, like 6 months ago.
It's like the end.
They
the
found it in the
20s.
street like 9
Yeah.
times in 10 years. I'm making up the numbers or something.
It's like
ridiculous.
so not.
You gotta make a case of public
But
health.
still a reason to
hazard.
argue.
Yeah. So we actually.
There are still people working against us, I guess, in that
Yeah.
capacity.
So Harrison wrote a petition when that DOI thing happened to the DEA and posted public comment. We got like 50 signatures from different scientists to oppose the DEA ruling, and then I am a part of the science drug policy group at Students for Sensible Drug Policy. So we do like lobbying for like science stuff. And so we were actually going against the DEA. We like had a pre-hearing scheduled and everything, and then they ended up pulling their ruling on a technicality because somebody else that is a founder of Panacea Plant Sciences, psychedelic science group, they called them out on their technicality and got them to pull their rule, so we didn't actually have to do the hearing. But they never proposed a new rule because they were like, oh, these people are not
Essentially,
around.
nobody wins.
Yeah. Well, we won because we got to still keep researching
There you
DOI.
go. Yeah.
So, but the reason why I said like researchers and scientists do have a place in policy is because we're the people doing the research and we can inform policymakers on what's actually happening, whether they want to believe it or not. We can try, you know. So I just think that's an important like advocacy tool that we have that's unique as experts in the field. And
Yeah.
like I said, whether they believe you or not, I recently spoke as the like scientific expert for the House of Representatives bill for psilocybin, reducing like the sentencing for psilocybin and allowing the medical use of psilocybin in Virginia. Gave this like great talk. There was like 3 other people who talked, including like a veteran, and they were just like, yeah, we're just gonna table it. And it was like, so okay, everyone wasted their time, and you didn't even listen to anything anyone was saying. So it's a battle that's ongoing, and I think that the more that people speak up about it and become active and become like advocates for it and are sharing like the facts and everything, I think that people are going to take it, the policymakers are going to take it more seriously when it's evidence-based versus if it's, because, you know, if it's just people being hippies, I guess, for a lack of a better word. Like, because that's what kind of happened from like the 1950s,
It's
right?
easier to write them off that way.
Yeah, it's easier to, and I don't think that's right, but like it's easier for the government to write you off if they don't take you seriously.
It's harder for them to write you off.
Show up
Write them.
prepared, otherwise you'll be dismissed.
Say that again.
I said it's harder for them to write you off if you write them.
So write your
House
Congress people. But I think that's our time. I hope everybody enjoyed this and